everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist, or the CLC Specialist with Texas System of Care. Today we are looking at the ABCs of CLC with persons living with disabilities. This is a webinar out of a series of webinars called the ABCs of CLC, CLC again standing for Cultural and Linguistic Competence, that we put on through Texas System of Care. All of our webinars that take a look at terminology and working with various populations is the first step before tuning into a podcast that's also on that same population. So be on the lookout for a podcast coming out as well. Now, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide very basic and foundational clarification on common terms in regards to cultural and linguistic competence, in order to help participants to better understand what's going on in more thorough topical presentations. So today's webinar is not going to go deep into concepts or go into specific etiquette in working with youth and children and parents and family members with disabilities. It's really just about the terminology so that you can kind of better use different terms and phrases in day-to-day life in your work, as well as be able to apply that knowledge of terminology when you do attend different training opportunities that do take a little bit of a deeper dive than what we're going to do today. This is intended to review prior to attending other Texas System of Care opportunities in regards to cultural and linguistic competence. However, I think you'll find that a lot of what we talk about today will be helpful in attending other training opportunities, whether or not that's provided by Texas System of Care specifically. So some different uses of the information today. Again, we're just going to be talking about terms, vocab, phrasing. Really, it's to either learn for the first time or maybe review, as this is fairly familiar to you, what current terminology is considered to be best practice or the most appropriate. We also hope that this will inspire deeper learning. I can't emphasize enough that you really won't come out of the webinar today specifically knowing how to implement and practice things differently. But hopefully this will inspire you to tap into some other training opportunities that may be out there or reach out to different resources. Also, potentially today's webinar may raise red flags to you that this is an area where you really do need to seek out some further opportunities. You may have a red flag raised that you don't know a whole lot about this population, and that's okay. That's definitely one outcome that is a positive outcome because it's raising awareness regarding what your current knowledge may be. So before we get started digging into some of the terms and phrases, if you have watched some of our webinars in the past from the ABCs of CLC series, this all will look fairly familiar to you because it's important to go over. So a little bit of a disclaimer about language. Language changes. It changes over and over. Sometimes pendulums of language and phrasing will kind of swing back and forth. That's just the name of the game, and sometimes it can feel a little bit frustrating for folks, or it can be a little bit confusing for folks. It also may cause some anxiety. Individuals may feel uncomfortable working with specific populations because coming from a place of wanting to respect others, folks may feel a little bit uneasy about how to say things, how to refer to folks. That is absolutely natural and understandable. However, as professionals, as folks who are serving youth and families, we really do need to overcome that apprehension and to make sure that we are doing our best to practice best practices and how we talk about folks, how we talk about youth and families and communities at large. Something else in regards to disclaimer, there is going to be different rates of change in language across time depending on who you're looking at and who you're talking about. So the way that individuals describe themselves, the way that grassroots activists and advocates describe communities, the way that larger institutions or even governmental entities will refer to populations at times, that's going to vary. A lot of different reasons for that. The larger an organization is, of course, the more bureaucracy may be in place. Larger organizations are also going to need to be a little bit leery of, okay, is this just like a quick little change in the language that is not going to be sustainable and last long term, as this is the way that the community wants to be described, or is this going to be more of a longer term deal type of a thing? So all of those different factors you are going to see, and we'll talk about this with this population in today's webinar as well, sometimes differences in how these different communities, organizations, and individuals refer to themselves and others. What we want to strive for as much as possible, have larger organizations, programs, entities be respectful and reflect in their language, whether on print materials or verbally, the language that individuals and communities at kind of the grassroots level wants to see done. Okay? So that is definitely something that we want to strive for, but again, you are going to sometimes see a difference with that. So, getting started with today's focus on persons living with disabilities, first of all, we have to take a look at that term, disability. So the term that you see on the slide for disability is literally from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, very cliche, I know, but this is also kind of the way that a lot of folks view disability. Now we're going to talk about some different ways of defining disability, but first of all, this definition from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, that disability is a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs, interferes with, or limits the person's ability to engage in certain tasks or actions or participate in typical daily activities and interactions, okay? That is probably a pretty familiar way of viewing disability and of defining disability. And that is the way that at large, most of society, most of our service institutions will define and refer to disability. This is a perspective coming from the medical model, which views disability as a condition, or another way of saying that, as an issue that interferes with, that limits, that impairs function, right? So from the medicinal or the medical model, that is kind of what we're looking at. Other ways of understanding disability includes the social model of disability, which doesn't view disabilities necessarily as a condition or an issue, but rather the social concept of disability is more about the way that society is structured in a way that does not always meet the needs of all different ways that people's bodies and or minds may function. And that's what we call disability. So to illustrate this a little bit more, and this is important to understand these two different ways of looking at disability, because that's really going to determine how folks use the rest of the terms that we're going to look at today. So from a social understanding, a social model of disability, just as an example, humans can't fly, right? At least in general, most human beings, our bodies do not have the function of being able to fly. So if we want to travel by air from one point to another, we utilize an airplane or a helicopter or some other, similar device type of a thing. That's not because there's something wrong with your body that you can't fly. It's just that you need to utilize an airplane or helicopter or some other device in order to move through the air to travel. Similar to that, someone may need to use a wheelchair in order to get from point A to point B. The medical model would say that there's something wrong with that person's body, that is kind of the driving point of that person having a disability. The social model of disability would say that person is utilizing their body and their mind very well. They're also utilizing a wheelchair. And so there's some equipment that is going to assist that person in getting from point A to point B. So if we have, for example, a mountain that folks want to get to the top of, because humans are not made like billy goats, maybe here and there, maybe we'll do some things like carve out some steps to get up that mountainside. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that body that has difficulty getting up the mountainside like a billy goat would. It means that stairs would help. A person who would have difficulty accessing a building that only has stairs and would do much better accessing the building with a ramp, there's nothing wrong with them if the building doesn't have a ramp. The issue is with the way that society is structuring things in a way that is excluding the functions of that body or of that mind if we're talking about different intellectual or cognitive disabilities, okay? Now, different folks are going to look at disability in different ways. So I mentioned before that most of society in general does take the medical model, looking at the Merriam-Webster's dictionary here, that disability means that there is some sort of impairment or kind of like infringement on someone's ability to do something. There are folks living with disabilities who see their own disability that way as well. And as we go throughout today's webinar, I'm going to take a look at different, specific communities within this larger community of individuals with disabilities and kind of take a look at, in general, folks with what specific conditions tend to look at things more from the medical model and what folks tend to look at things from more of the social model of disability. And again, even though today's webinar is not about concepts, not about specific etiquette, not about taking a look at specific clinical considerations, having this understanding of these two very different ways of defining disability is really important to understand and get to the bottom of likely what folks are going to prefer, what terminology, what phrasing they're going to prefer that you use in general in referring to them or to the community as a whole. So before we move on there, though, I did want to take a little look again at a couple of terms that we went over in our very, very first webinar that was titled This versus That, our very first ABCs of CLC webinar where we compared words that oftentimes get really confused in these different cultural competence trainings. So I want to take a look again at individualisms and institutionalisms. So first of all, an individualism is what a lot of folks think about any time that an ism is brought up. And by ism, I mean things like racism, sexism, or what we're talking about today is called ableism. So when these isms come up, for example, ableism, again, this is typically what people think about. This is the direct person-to-person discrimination or oppression, saying something that is inappropriate, whether that was the intent or not. This is typically what people think about. And this is absolutely something that is important to take into consideration. That's the purpose behind different cultural competence trainings that focus on you as an individual in whatever your role may be, working with other individuals, working with families, making sure that you're not committing any snafus or, being irresponsible with your practice. But there are larger issues as well called institutionalism. So in the case of today, institutional ableism. This is where discriminatory practices, oppressive practices are ingrained within the structure of an institution at large. This can be because of the specific policies and procedures that are in place that do not take into account all of the individuals that an organization is going to see or is going to serve. Sometimes institutionalisms come out of a history of purposeful oppression. So the cartoon that we see here is taking a look at the issue of redlining, which in the original This versus That webinar for the ABC of CLC series we talked about a little bit more in depth, where folks drew up laws, policies, procedures, whatever the case may be, to purposefully discriminate against groups of people. And even if laws come along eventually that try to undo that, those laws help, but there may still be some institutional isms that are in place going on. Sometimes institutional isms, such as institutional ableism, can be created not because the original folks who developed policies, procedures, laws, whatever the case may be, sought out to discriminate against different groups, but simply because there was not representation at the table. Those folks did not know how to adequately address the needs of all of the populations that they would serve. So, for example, when we're talking about folks living with disabilities, there are certainly laws on the books that are trying to make sure that individuals with disabilities are not being discriminated against. But you cannot possibly write a law for every single minute thing that may come up. So your organization may be technically adhering to specific, laws that are in place, but may still be functioning at a place where an individual who is not living with a specific disability may have more success in accessing services and continuing through services and in leaving services than an individual who does. So wanted to kind of readdress that because that is certainly these different isms, whether at an individual level or an institutional level, is something important to keep in mind for all any population that we're talking about. So I want to go through, and we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the difference between person-first language and identity-first language. So let's take these one at a time. First of all, person-first language is a way of talking about or referring to or talking to someone who is living with a disability. And so you can see with my cute little stick figure here that, yes, I did make. I'm very proud of that. I'm just kidding. This way of describing folks addresses the individual first, and then it lists whatever disability that person is living with. So the idea of this person-first language is to make sure that the humanity of persons with disabilities is being addressed and is being respected. Now, this is after many, many, many years, thousands of years in human history and in the U.S. hundreds of years as well, of not referring to and talking about or to persons with disabilities in a respectful way. A lot of these outdated terms that we will take a look at some of those terms more in depth a little bit later, but a lot of those terms were in very, very popular use for a very long time. And in response to that, trying to refer to persons living with disabilities in a way that is more respectful of the population, this was kind of a response to that, to make sure that even in our language, we were putting out there, people are people first, and then, there may be other situations or conditions or scenarios that they are living with, but individuals are people first. Because so often if you see someone with a very visible disability, which not all disabilities are highly visible, but if you do see someone with a very visible disability, it may be a common error to think of that person by what you are seeing regarding their disability first. So a good example of this, that kind of, pendulum shift type of a thing, was in 1990, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The previous name of the act had the word handicapped in it. Handicapped is from the beginning not respectful term. It's not one of those cases where a term was originally created to be respectful and then over time it became derogatory. From the very beginning of that word handicap, it was referring to individuals with disabilities because of not having social access to proper education and proper employment and so on and so forth, had to take their cap out in their hand and, beg, essentially, as the main source of income. And so, or at least that was the image at the time of folks living with disabilities. So handicapped is not a term that was ever meant to be very particularly respectful to folks. So that term changed to individuals with disabilities, person-first language. First, we recognize that these are individuals, and then we recognize that, yes, they have a disability. Now, this is opposed to identity-first language. Identity-first language, just like it sounds, does kind of the opposite of what person-first language does. And the reason for this and why some folks living with disabilities may prefer this language is because this is for individuals who consider their disability to very much be a part of their identity. Someone who would prefer identity-first language would say, I am XYZ. That is a part of me. You cannot separate me from this disability. I view the world differently because of this disability. I engage with my community differently, in part because of this disability. You cannot separate me from this disability. It's a part of who I am. And oftentimes, that comes from a very empowered place where an individual is proud to be part of, for example, the deaf community, or is proud to be considered autistic, that they say, I am autistic, I'm not a person with autism. Okay? So I hope that helps to clarify a little bit these two very, very different ways of referring to people with disabilities. And what I just used was person-first language, people with disabilities, as opposed to saying disabled people or individuals or so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to do a little rundown. Side note, I came up with a genius idea about 2 business days ago to do a sound effect on this, and it was not enough time. So we're just going to pretend that we have a little sound effect, kind of think radio monster truck, like run down.
Run down.
There you go. He does it better than I do. So couldn't get the sound effect in time, but there you go. That's our little sound effect. So we're going to go ahead and take a look line by line at these different communities within the larger community of individuals living with disabilities and see what in general, and these are huge generalizations, folks will tend to prefer, okay? So first of all, very large umbrella statement. Do you say person living with a disability, or do you say disabled person? It does depend on who you are talking to, and that is going to be the theme for the rest of the webinar. And honestly, pretty much in all of our webinars, that's the theme, is you really don't know until you have that conversation with the person or ask the individual. So this is really, really split. There are some themes that can be found within specific disabilities, within communities of specific disabilities. So if we're talking about the autistic community or this community or that community, and we're going to take a look at those in a second. So because of that, erring on the side of caution is going to be better when you're referring to at-large communities of individuals living with disabilities. And the safer way to go does tend to be the person-first language side of things. So person-first language is on the left side of the screen there. Identity-first language is on the right side. I would recommend in general in your materials or when you're talking that you err on the side of person-first language when you're talking about really at large. So person with disabilities, persons with disabilities, living with disabilities, who have disabilities, all of those are fairly interchangeable, because as far as what has more potential to offend, identity first is probably going to be more likely to get under people's skin more if they prefer person first language versus if someone prefers identity first language using person first language. And the reason for that is because when you're using, as a larger organization, identity first language, folks don't know if you are ignorant and using antiquated ways of talking before there was this kind of shift towards person first language, or if you're super on top of things and you're wording things that way because members of your local community have expressed that they want you to use identity first language, okay? So in general, when we're speaking very, very broadly, it is a little bit safer to go with the person first language. Now, person with diabetes versus diabetic person. And here, when we're using the example of diabetes, but what I'm about to say really can apply for pretty much any chronic medical condition. So things like Crohn's disease, things like chronic pain, those are going to fall along the same rough rules or generalizations of what I'm about to say in regards to diabetes. So diabetes being a medical condition that folks, interact with the medical community for, they interact with, primary care providers and with specialists for. Oftentimes, persons living with a chronic medical condition are going to view this condition from that medical model of understanding disability. And so because of that, they're more likely to view things from a construct of like, yes, I have to manage this. I have to overcome this. I have to deal with this condition that I have, as opposed to seeing it as part of their identity. Again, this is a huge generalization here. So you are going to find folks who have diabetes and are going to say, I am a diabetic. That is how I think of myself. It is a part of my identity. But overall, for these chronic medical conditions, it is going to probably be more of a person-first framework, where people want you to acknowledge that they are humans first, that they are not defined by this condition, and that they do not consider this condition to be a part of their identity. So it has a huge impact in their life. They don't consider it necessarily to be a part of their larger identity of who they are, and they don't want to be defined by it. Always going to be exceptions, but in general, when it comes to chronic medical conditions, you'll want to stick with person-first language. Autism. Ooh, this is where it really gets debated a lot. It does, let me tell you, between person-first language versus identity-first language. So again, we're going to talk in generalizations here. And again, this all comes from the understanding of how you view disability. So is a child's or a youth or an adult's disability from the medical model like a condition that that person has and they have to manage and they kind of have to learn to live with it type of a thing? Or is it a part of an individual's identity and it's something that, yes, makes them different than folks who do not have that disability, but everyone is different, everyone has different things, this is a piece of who I am and it's important to me type of a thing. So in general, it has been found that a lot of parents of children and youth who have autism, especially if their children are younger, are going to prefer the person-first language, that is, person or child who has autism. In general, we find that the children themselves, once they get a little bit older into adolescence and into adulthood, oftentimes are going to refer or prefer the identity-first language, because that youth comes to feel that their autism is very much a part of who they are. It's very much a part of their identity. So there can be oftentimes this kind of bumping of heads when we talk about family voice, when we talk about parents and other family members who care for these children versus maybe youth voice, some of our older youth who have autism. To them, it's not that they have autism. It's not some sort of like accessory like a belt or something that they can just take off. they are autistic or they are an autistic. Okay, so this is very, very much debated within the autistic community. So because of that, it really comes down to knowing who you're working with. If you have a program that is mostly working with very young children and their parents, then you're probably going to want to go with a person who has autism or children who have autism. Parents have their own journey in coming to understand what it means to have an autistic child or to have a child who has autism, depending on how you frame that. So these different ways of understanding and viewing things need to be respected. If you have a program that is mostly dealing with maybe older youth or even with adults or young adults, then you might want to go with the autistic first, the identity first one, and perhaps even note that's, the reasons that you're phrasing it that way. This is why I'm going to get up on a little family voice, youth voice soapbox for a little bit, which my family voice and youth voice colleagues are going to enjoy very much. This is why it's so incredibly important to have within your organizations and within your larger system of care community to have that strong family voice and to have that strong youth voice that is inclusive and is diverse, and those are not necessarily exactly the same things, so that you can have input from your local community. You can have input from the youth and families within your local community that have these different disabilities that we're talking about today, what a specific preference may be, so that you can kind of be guided and what would be in that local area, the way that you want to phrase things and word things, and you can defend that and say, this is actually coming from a group of youth who identify themselves as autistic, or this is actually coming from a group of youth and families who want our materials to reflect the person-first language, person who has autism type of thing. So youth voice and family voice is very important because of a lot of different reasons, and this difference in preference of terminology is one example of where that's important. Next, a person who uses a wheelchair versus a wheelchair user. For this one, again, it's one of those things where it could really, really be both. Remember what I said before, however, about identity first language has maybe, when it comes to larger programs and organizations, more potential for conflict or for offense than the person first language does. So in your materials, or if you're speaking in general about a population, people first language is probably going to be better whenever you're talking about folks who have to use one sort of equipment or another. Here's the example given as a wheelchair. Could be talking about other equipment as well. But individuals may prefer for themselves, they may see themselves as a wheelchair user, not a person who uses a wheelchair. Person with bipolar disorder versus bipolar person. Again, this is something where it's going to depend on the person a lot, but by and large, a lot of folks who have bipolar disorder or other types of mood disorders are going to prefer that person first language as well. Oftentimes, these may be conditions that there's been a lot of stigma around, a big lack of understanding in larger society about what it looks like to live your life and move through life, move through the world with something like bipolar disorder. So an individual, though it definitely is going to impact their life, may not necessarily identify as I am bipolar or I am a bipolar. Is another way of wording that. Always exceptions. Definitely, there are definitely people that that's not the case for, but in general we want person first language there. And then lastly on our list, person who is deaf versus deaf person, and I'll speak about the little d, big D thing in a second as well. This again is one of those things where it really depends, but actually in large when we're talking about the deaf community, a lot of folks are going to prefer deaf person. If they completely do not have hearing, then it would be deaf. If there's some hearing, then that would be referred to as hard of hearing. Now, not everyone who is deaf or is hard of hearing considers themselves to be part of the deaf community. So this is a little bit tricky. Being part of the deaf community, it really is a community. It has its own culture, it has its own customs, its own norms. Of course, it has its own language. It really, really is a culture in and of itself. Not everyone who is deaf or is significantly hard of hearing necessarily considers themselves to be a part of that community. But if they are a part of that community culturally, then typically they're going to prefer to be referred to as a deaf person because their identity first. This is not just some medical condition that I happen to have. I'm a person first and then I also happen to be deaf. I am deaf. That is something, it's not the only thing that defines me, but it is a huge thing that defines me. It's a huge part of my life. I want to be referred to as a deaf person. Same goes for blind. That can be said. Very similar thing that folks may consider themselves to be part of a blind community, so they consider it to be a very solid part of their identity, blind person. Now, the big D, little d thing, that is very, very similar to what we're talking about with the framework of person first versus identity first. Big D is talking about this culture, this deaf community at large. Little d is more talking about the condition of not having hearing or being hard of hearing. So it's kind of a similar thing. However, folks will have different preferences about whether to use lowercase d or capitalized D. A pretty safe way to go, again, anytime you're working with an individual, is ask them how they want to be referred. But when you're talking about a community at large, for this community, it would be deaf individuals, deaf person, deaf community. And when you're talking about the community, to capitalize that D, to, again, give that significance that this is a community with its own culture, with its own norms, with its own language, and then lowercase d if you're talking about, if you're using the word deaf in the context of the condition type of a thing. Okay. So next thing we want to talk about, hopefully this person first versus identity first, I was able to clarify that pretty well. Now I want to talk about inspiration porn. You probably either know already what I'm talking about, you've heard it before, or you have never heard this before and it kind of sounds like a weird thing to be talking about. So if you haven't guessed yet, we're not talking about porn in any way that is sexual here. This is just what this concept is called. So inspiration porn is essentially when persons who do not have a disability essentially kind of objectify people who do have a disability in order to be inspired or to feel better about themselves, or to kind of applaud, cheer on non-disabled people who treat someone living with a disability like a human, as if that's an incredibly honorable or heroic thing, where it's really just a human treating another human like a human, which should be a standard that we all have day in and day out in our lives. So some examples here, these are different memes, real memes, I didn't make these up, from the internet. One says, he asked her to prom even in her condition. Like and share equals respect. So, this is a meme that is posted online, kind of passed around, and it really makes some people feel good for him, good for this little, guy for asking this girl out to prom, when the reality is it is just a young person asking another young person out to prom. It's cute, it's exciting, we should feel happy about it because it's a cute and exciting time for these young people in their lives, but it's not that this boy is heroic or honorable. This is a very typical thing that we see all the time, and of course we would want any youth who are living with disabilities to also get asked out to the prom. People with disabilities have relationships, they date, it's not a heroic thing on the part of the young man there. Another one, this is a very, very popular quote, apparently that Scott Hamilton originally said. It's been put on a lot of different images of people living with a very visible physical disability. It says the only disability in life is a bad attitude. Now, this young man here, he is going for a swim, and if he competes and he wins things and he gets medals and he gets trophies, that is wonderful and that is great and that is admirable, but it's not any more great or admirable than a young man who doesn't have a disability that is visually apparent. These types of images, there's another one there that shows a young child using a wheelchair, says your excuse is invalid. These types of images, they really objectify, and that's where this term comes from, inspiration porn. They objectify the individuals who are in the images. It is not necessarily particularly inspiring that a person with a disability would do something with their body or with their mind. If they win a Nobel Peace Prize, that's amazing. Just like if anyone else wins a Nobel Peace Prize, that's amazing. But if they go grocery shopping, if a person does their math homework, if a person participates in school sports, then that's good. Those are good things. But it's that individual using their body and using their mind to the full extent of the abilities of their body or of their mind, just like anybody else. So as far as how this inspiration porn impacts the disabled community being identity first language, I could say communities of persons with disabilities, to use person first language there. It doesn't do a lick of good for any of these individuals, and if anything, it can cause significant harm because it perpetuates this idea that folks should have low expectations for persons with disabilities, and that just being human, being kind, interacting in a very typical way with someone who has a disability is somehow heroic. So these types of images, this way of viewing disabilities, this way of viewing persons living with disabilities is it can be very impactful and in a very, very negative way. Now this isn't necessarily a term. You don't necessarily need to memorize the term for day-to-day language. You probably won't use the term inspiration porn very often, but the concept of inspiration porn and the various ways in our society that it comes out other than just internet memes is important to have an understanding of. So I want to go through a few different ways that we would definitely not recommend speaking. So first of all, correcting someone's language in reference to themselves. We spent a lot of time taking a look at person first language and identity first language, which communities in general prefer which way, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, if someone wants to speak a certain way about themselves, about their community, it's really not a non-disabled person to correct that. So, for example, if a youth says, I'm diabetic, or I'm bipolar, or I'm autistic, whatever the case may be, a very not appropriate response to that would be like, oh, no, you need to use person first language because I attended this one training where they told me that, and now I'm trying to relearn how to talk, so you're talking wrong about yourself. That is just a really, really silly response, and no youth is going to want any of that, right? That's going to damage your rapport, and, you know, for the youth who is speaking that way, they probably are either just talking that way because that's the way they've always heard things and they don't really give a lot of thought to the way they're speaking, or they have very purposefully thought through, they've engaged either face-to-face or maybe online with different resources with peers who are also members of their same disability community, and they have come to the point where, at least at this point in time, they're using identity first language, okay? People first language, like we were talking about before, does tend to be kind of the safer bet, but if an individual is not using that, we're not going to quote-unquote correct that, you know? They're the person living with a disability, or they're the disabled person, so if they want to use identity first language or they want to use person first language, whatever the case may be, that should be respected. Now, of course, here I'm not talking about language being used in a way that is self-deprecating. So, you know, picking up on tone of voice and the context of what someone is saying, if someone is being self-deprecating in the way that they're talking, or if a family member or someone else in the life of this person is using language in a way that is inappropriate, then of course that's something to have a conversation about and explore. But even in that context, you probably wouldn't open up that conversation with, no, person first language, because I went to a training and this is the way we talk. Like, that's just not an appropriate response. And it's something that is very, very frustrating to a lot of folks living with different disabilities. Framing either the person or the disability as a burden. There are a lot of different ways, and on the next slide we're going to take a look at some examples of these different things on this no-no list. But anytime that in our language, if the way that we're phrasing it paints the picture that the person is a burden or the disability is a burden, we want to try to stay away from that. Even from the medical model of viewing disability, where folks may view their disability as genuinely something that, it's limiting, it's like a burden in my life type of a thing, the person is never, ever a burden, okay? Another thing that we want to try to avoid is patronizing terms. This is, again, getting back to the mindset of like inspiration porn that we were talking about a little bit ago, that we shouldn't have high expectations of folks living with disabilities and talking to and about individuals as if they're children, okay? People hate that. Everyone hates that. I hate being patronized. I don't know anyone who likes being patronized. Either to my face or, you know, about me type of a thing. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes that. It doesn't matter if you have a disability or not. You don't like that. So let's not do it to folks, right? We really have to be especially careful about our language in situations where maybe there's young children who have a disability. Perhaps their parents are dealing with loss of what they thought life with their child was going to look like, and they're going to have to go through an emotional process of learning what it means to have a child with whatever disability we're talking about. There may be the sensation of patronizing terms to describe the child to try to almost like, quote unquote, like normalize the situation, or like, no, your child's not handicapped, they're handy-capable, like, yay, type of a thing. But that child is not going to be a child forever. You know, maybe right now that child is, 2 or 3, and we are mostly dealing, as far as emotions go, with the situation with the parents and with the family at large. That child is going to grow up. And if they're still being referred to when they're 12, 17, 30, 55 in terms that are meant with like children in mind, that's so extremely not appropriate. So we really, really need to be careful about terms that have good intentions. These patronizing terms always come from a place of good intentions, bad impact, negative impact. And then, of course, outdated derogatory terms, whether those are terms that were initially created and for a time were appropriate and were not disrespectful, but the meaning has kind of changed over time, or whether from the very beginning, like we were talking about handicaps a little bit earlier, the term was never appropriate to begin with. So another rundown. If we had sound effects, this one would have the original rundown.
Rundown.
There you go. And then, like Mr. Kool-Aid Man says, oh yeah, it would be like, oh no.
Oh no.
There you go. Okay. So, gotta keep it light. I can't tell if anyone is laughing at this or just, whatever. So these are all terms that we don't want to see continue to be used, whether verbally or in writing. And this gets really sticky and complicated because some of these terms that you see here are still commonly used. Some of them very commonly used. The first example, like we've talked about a few times, is the term handicapped. Was never from the very beginning of this term meant to be particularly respectful, continues to be used, unfortunately. So first of all, if you're talking about not people but objects, things like parking spaces or bathroom stalls or things like that, the appropriate way to refer to those items or spaces are accessible. These are accessible parking spaces. These are accessible ramps, accessible bathroom stalls type of a thing. You still, unfortunately, do see the word handicapped in use when it's talking about these items. In regards to referring to individuals, thankfully you see that less. A lot of things that used to refer to folks as being handicapped, have been renamed and changed. Still, if you're talking about some very large institutions or some very old written materials, those may be there. So we really want to see that get phased out as much as possible. Next word, retarded. This is fairly well understood that this is not an appropriate term. Some of the others, folks may not necessarily have heard, so to speak, that they're not appropriate anymore. Retarded is pretty much in larger society common knowledge that is no longer appropriate. However, it is still in the names of some institutions and writings and this, that, and the other thing. So that's an example of, larger institutions not really keeping up with the times completely. Invalid, cripple, consumer, those are all examples of older ways of speaking that are becoming outdated. One that is still largely in use is consumer. We see that a lot in mental health and referring to persons who utilize resources. Folks hate that. Youth and adults and family members hate it. The term is, in regards to mental health at least, persons with lived experience is the go-to term, and that's what we really try to promote as far as our language and Texas system of care when we're talking about the youth and families that we're working with. The actual youth with whatever mental health condition we're talking about is a youth with lived experience. An adult is a peer with lived experience. Family member of a youth with lived experience, that's the language that we use. The next two examples on the right-hand side are some examples of those patronizing terms. Came from a good place, not really hitting the mark. When you're actually, a youth or an adult living with some form of a disability, these cutesy little differently abled, physically challenged, special, handy-capable, so cute, like, ugh, kind of like, ugh, give me a break type of a thing. I'm a grown person, like, stop talking to me and about me as if I were 2 years old, because I'm not. And then the last one, wheelchair bound or confined. This is an example of looking at disabilities and persons with disabilities, kind of from a perspective of like, oh, it's a lot of suffering that's going on, and oh, it's so terrible. I'm just a person who needs to use a wheelchair, right? It's no big deal, not bound, not confined. It is something that needs to be used in order to get from point A to point B, right? So that's just a real quick look through of some applications for a little bit of the no-no list. Now, having said all of these no-nos, ways of not saying things, ways of not talking, like anything else, and a lot of the different communities that we highlight in this webinar series, you're going to see reclaiming take place. And by reclaiming, we mean taking words that typically we would be considered to be derogatory or inappropriate, and the individual or a community at large taking that word back, reclaiming that word, kind of twisting it on its head, so to speak, so that it becomes an empowering thing. You can see on the screen, this is a picture of an activist, a disability activist named Stella Young. And on the left-hand side is a quote from her, just to give you an example of how she really comes from this social model of disability as far as how she views her disabilities, her worldview type of a thing. She says, "I'm not a snowflake. I am not a sweet and scintillating symbol of the fragility of life. I'm a strong, fierce, flawed adult woman. I plan to remain that way in life and in death." Okay, so it's kind of her worldview and how she sees things. And then in regards to her, she is known for referring to herself as a crip, short for cripple. She says, "People get all up in arms when I describe myself as a crip because what they hear is the word cripple, and they hear a word you're not allowed to say anymore." For Stella, this is empowering to refer her to herself this way. This is her deciding to take a word that has a history of negativity from the beginning. You know, cripple is, again, one of those words that was never created in a respectful manner. It's from Old English with the imagery of, you know, persons with disabilities, like creeping along type of a thing. That's the roots of that word. And she's taking it back, and she's kind of owning it. Now, again, there's a difference between reclaiming, taking something back, owning it in a manner that is really, really empowering, and talking about oneself in a negative way or in a self-deprecating way. Those are two very, very distinct things. So if someone calls themselves XYZ, and it's not simply because, you know, they were never given the memo that that's not the best way to phrase things and they don't necessarily care, and it's not like I am this type of a thing, then that is certainly something that you want to have a conversation about and see how they're doing with their own journey of understanding what having a disability or being disabled means to them, how they view that, do they have the social supports in place to have that emotional support and learn how to, depending on how they view things, either live with their disability or live in a world that is not structured in a way to make functioning very easy with their disability. Okay, two different ways of viewing that type of a thing. So I hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. Again, this is just meant to be initial introductory level terminology and phrasing. Be on the lookout for a podcast series to come out to take a little bit of a deeper look at working with youth and families with disabilities. I hope you enjoyed the webinar today, and I believe we're out of time. We might have a minute or two left if there were any questions that came through. Well, we do have our email address there. You can see info@txsystemofcare.org if a question does pop into your head later on, or if you just want to learn more about anything that was said here today. If you have a particular request for a webinar that you would like to see, please let us know. We monitor that email address, and we'll make sure that it gets to the right person or connect you to the right resource or whatever the case may be. So if there aren't any questions, that's all I got for you today. So have a wonderful day, and That's it. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.